Dear friends, the other day someone's asked me what are my thoughts on what should be done to prevent a repeat of the kinds of policies that we saw during COVID. And this is one of the things, if you'd asked me in 2020, I'd have given a different answer. And in fact, I have a different answer in my book, The Great Hysteria and the Broken State. And if you ask me today, it's a completely different answer. And the reason why it's different is because in the past, in the initial phase, I assumed that public health was making some kind of a big blunder, that they had not thought through their policies properly, and they were imposing things in a haste, etc. And then I started reading up much more, and it turned out, and by now I've got 100% proof that the actual problem is the science, the so-called science of public health. So public health has been strongly promoting all the policies that we saw during COVID. They are found in its textbooks, they are found in its journal articles. The kinds of arguments used are generally based on ethics, being morally good, or based on things like mathematical models. In each case, there is absolutely no relationship with empiricism, which is what science should be all about. Sometimes they do mention a few examples of so-called success of their, interventions, but that's completely wrong, and I will come to shortly. So what I'm doing right now is I'm writing a paper or a blog post for my Times of India blog on this topic. I also had a chat with a gentleman who asked me this question earlier today, and I can see where he was coming from, and I can see how far people have to reach in order to understand the actual problem. One of the things in medicine, for example, or any other scientific discipline, is that if you don't understand the cause, you cannot fix a problem. You're trying to fix a plumbing issue, you need to know the cause. Likewise, you need to know why did these things happen in the first place. Definitely, they did not happen out of sheer accident. So the person I was talking to was hoping to get from me some simplistic solutions by which existing legislation in Australia could be amended to bring about change. I had to sort of disappoint this person and say, sorry, but that's actually not going to work. What is happening is there is there is no barrier. So essentially, it's a free for all. I've mentioned in a couple of writings, but basically, there's a free for all in public health. It has got no methodology, no systems of validation of anything, and a complete free for all where one fine day a guy called Neil Ferguson can walk into newspaper office with a paper or send them a paper basically saying that millions of whatever hundreds of thousands of people are going to die in the UK, and people publish that all over the world. There is no check on that whole paper. It was not even peer reviewed, but peer review is the completely most utterly useless exercise in the field of medicine in particular, also in many other areas. But in medicine, I would say that 95% of the peer reviewed work is complete junk. I say that very, after a lot of consideration. I'm not trying to undermine the medical discipline, but I can say that the research done in its name is largely bogus. In the worst cases, it actually marketing propaganda of the pharmaceutical companies. One of the recent examples I'll talk about later, but I also mention here in this context is the so-called peer-reviewed paper in the Lancet, which claims that 154 million lives have been saved by vaccines in the past 50 years, since 1974. Well, a very quick look at that paper. I actually spent a total of maybe 6 hours looking at here and there, thinking about things over the next few days. Total of 6 hours of brain work to prove that the paper is such a piece of rubbish. And I've written in the Times of India blog on this whole thing. And yet the Lancet did not withdraw it. I shared the paper with not only the Lancet, but with its main authors, the ones that I could find on Twitter, for example. The other ones, the email address is missing. So what we've seen is that the peer-reviewed process has produced such utter junk and such big lies on such a large scale that it is a shame that these kind of things exist. The so-called medical journals exist, which do not do their job properly. But back to the overall issue of why exactly what should be done to stop the COVID problem or the repeat of COVID, not the problem, but the repeat of COVID policies. So, what we have is to recognize that the problem is inbuilt into public health. Those policies were promoted by public health. They included things like quarantine, vaccine mandates, school closures. All these things were actually uh, tried in the past and they failed miserably. And there's sufficient documentation if anybody wants to check, but nobody wants to check, looks like in public health. And so they all do models and other things like ethics. So, one of the things to recognize that if you take 100 people from public health and ask them questions on things like quarantine and lockdowns and vaccine mandates, 98% of them will be on one side promoting these totalitarian policies. It's only 2% that might say no, but they might not be really good. Even these 2%, by the way, do not come out ever saying that this thing is bad. They will quibble about the thing. They'll say it might be bad, it might be good. Who knows? If that 2% is also not so clear about what exactly should be done. In the end, the predominant opinion is that of those 98% people, which supports those kinds of policies. So, by simply trying to change legislation when such policies are inbuilt into the public health literature, will not change anything. The person on the phone today was talking to me, he's raised the question. He's talking to me about the so called pandemic plans. Well, I explained to him that pandemic plans, even I was misguided initially, thinking that they actually don't recommend lockdowns. Therefore, these lockdowns were not supposed to be done. But actually, they did not rule out lockdowns. They did not rule out anything. They basically said this is not recommended, but in some particular cases, some severe cases, people might want to do it or for a short period or whatever. Everything in public health is all over the place, and there is no clarity on any of these so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions. So then we look at vaccine mandates. Everybody's, all the public health books and health economics books include, a recommendation for vaccine mandates. I even mentioned to this person that even Jay Bhattacharya's book on health economics supports vaccine mandates. So when a situation is in that category where predominant views are the ones that we saw during COVID, how can we expect the thing to change by simply making a few changes in the legislation? Hmm? And the other thing that not many people are aware of, which I only became aware of after a fair bit of reading, is that these things, whatever happened in COVID, has happened in the past on a much smaller scale in many cases. In some cases, a bit larger, like the plague and the Spanish flu, etc. But in most cases, a bit smaller. But all these things have happened in the past, for the past 500, 600 years. Almost all. Vaccine mandates obviously happened only from the 19th century. But virtually everything else has happened in the past. And so what we have seen is that this is nothing new. So what we saw was what is in the textbooks, and what we will see in the future is the same thing that's in the textbooks. And the other part that people forget, and I keep reminding them, is that while a few of us are questioning the whole thing and opposing it, etc., public health has managed to publish hundreds of articles in journals, so peer reviewed journals, that prove that lockdowns were successful, that claim that Vaccines have saved 100 million lives. We know Donald Trump, for example, claiming 100 million lives saved by vaccines, and so on. So what I'm saying is there is no way on earth that you can stop these things from happening again. And if everybody, let's say 98% of the discipline supports them, these policies, and the other 2% are not sure whether they're good or bad. So I've been asking doctors, can you please sign this declaration for abolition of quarantine? Only one doctor in the whole world has signed up yet. Why? Because they somehow think that no, quarantine will work. Many of them have a mistaken belief that focused protection will work. We just need to put these people, elderly people, into some kind of a place, have PCR tests done on everybody all the time, all the kind of complex things that are mentioned in the Great Barrington Declaration. They've got this mythology that they can magically stop the spread of COVID to these people. Well, they forget that they can't stop it even in hospitals where they have complete control. Hospitals have nosocomial infections where I think my estimate is around 2 million people every year die across the world from infections that they catch in the hospital. So if you can't stop the spread of infectious diseases in hospitals, you're trying to stop the spread in an uncontrolled condition, which is essentially the aged care centers, where they don't have the kind of paraphernalia of controls that are available to hospitals. Anyway, the GBD authors have not yet changed their strategy or whatever. I've been requesting them to do that, and so they've also not signed up to the abolition of quarantine. The call that I've made. So, in a situation like this, where there is great propaganda by the journals, there is the peer review process is in complete shambles, where everything that happened in COVID has happened in the past, and now they have the so-called discipline has got much more proof that these things work. How can you possibly stop a repeat of these things happening and in a much worse and a much more dangerous way? That is the question, really. It's not a simple question at all. And so, in my answer, which I'm going to publish shortly in the Times of India in a couple of few days, let's say, is I've got how many solutions are these? There are five. Yes, five solutions broadly. Let me run through them very quickly. One is we need the public health discipline to be reviewed from scratch. That's what I've been doing for the past 2 years. We need a mass scale project on this whole thing. You need to expand the kind of work I'm doing by a factor of 10, get another 10, 20 people involved, study the thing very thoroughly in each case, come out with conclusive recommendations and findings, and that should form or inform new textbooks on public health. So the science of public health has to be completely redone. Public health is the most unscientific thing on earth. There is nothing as bad as this. You can have a look at the textbooks and you'll soon realize how hopeless these things are, their textbooks are. So the textbook writing is, I've been talking about Center for Scientific Public Health, or there could be so many other options for doing that, but there needs to be textbooks written on public health, on all things such as quarantine, etc. The other one is we need, once that finding is in place, I mean, already I've got sufficient proofs and, that should be sufficient. But if people want, they can study for another few years and come out with the finding that quarantine of all forms must be abolished. They must also come out with the view that vaccine mandates should be abolished, all of them, regardless of any condition. They should not be mandatory. And if these two policies are complete barriers, we erect a wall against these two policies through legislation, possibly in the Constitution, but at least legislation, right? The third point that I've got is something which most people aren't able to understand. I spoke to this person on the phone. He sort of said, yeah, that's a good idea, but unfortunately, he thinks that the way the system works, we can only do some incremental change. I said, look, the drugs regulator in Australia is the TGA. They are doctors themselves, so you can still defer to the doctors if you want, if that's what the public wants. But make sure that there is a very high level of proof required before things like masks and other things are imposed on society. That's why we need to have a single point of decision making for all these non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, masks, and all that stuff. So what that does is anybody can propose. There will be maybe a health department, CDC. Anybody can then take that proposal to the drugs regulator, and that drugs regulator will publish a cost benefit analysis, will publish all the scientific evidence, and on the basis of that, we will find the actual viability or suitability of that particular intervention. Then the other point which I am very clear about, some people don't seem to understand, but I'll explain why, is that there is simply no possibility of any doctor doing justice to the concept of public health. Medicine is a radically different thing to public health. If we don't understand that, we are fooling ourselves in a very big way. A doctor who is a clinical clinician has to know a certain amount of detailed information, then compare that with an individual and then decide for that individual. In the case of public health, there is not a single, really one or two pieces of minor medical information or biological information involved. But 99% of the information involved is broad society-wide impacts and assessments. That is not something doctors know anything about. They're not taught even a single class on cost benefit analysis. They don't understand trade offs, opportunity costs, nothing. And so these people are simply unfit to do public health, which is why we have such a big mess. And that is why I have a recommendation that only economists should head public health everywhere. And that too, not all general economists like macroeconomists and those, financial economists and all this kind of varieties that we have. Instead, we need specific economists that are specialized in well-being, human well-being and happiness. These studies are quite specific, and we don't get, it's very limited to a set of economists. Those are the economists who can actually judge whether the policy proposal of a doctor or somebody makes any sense for the whole society. Any doctor or whatever necessary medical or engineering advice should be attached to this particular economist, of course. The other things that I've got here are too many to list here today, but they will be required as well. We need to get rid of things like the precautionary principle. We need to mandate cost benefit analysis, etc. We also need a new health system. I've been talking about it in a number of places, but also in this case, I explained to this gentleman, and he then understood why, that doctors panic the most. Throughout history, it is the doctors and nurses, particularly doctors, who panic first. And that's why the society panics during a pandemic. The people don't know what's going on. They really can't see the pandemic happening in front of them. What they come across is this information, the gossip coming from the doctors. The doctors, being the front line, they're always very terrified if they think that this is going to kill them. They're terrified and they flee. They run away. This has been happening throughout history. And in this particular case of COVID, they are the ones who started the panic in China, in UK, in Australia. And I've cited hundreds of examples of this kind of thing. It's on the website, a big list in the COVID itself of how doctors panicked. So if we want to stop doctors panicking, you need to give them assurance that these COVID people or whatever the serious disease they're talking about, those patients will go to an isolation hospital, right? And so these guys who are doing the frontline work will not panic and stop doing everything. That's the first thing. So you need to have isolation hospitals. And I'm going to go into details of all this kind of stuff. Many other things that I've been suggesting in my review. That's, again, too much detail. But this broadly is the sequence of actions that need to be taken if we want to stop COVID totalitarianism or terrorism. I call it, public health terrorism. If you want to stop it, then you have to do the entire suite. You just can't tinker a few things here and there and expect it to work. All right, so that was my summary of my opinions on this issue at the moment, and I'll continue doing my work and will share with everybody as time permits. Thank you. Bye.